We've come a very long way since this search began. If you haven't already watched at least episodes 3 and 4, I encourage you to go back and do that first, especially episode 4, because everything we're about to explore in this video builds on what we found there. What I'm going to share here isn't a recovered myth. It's a creative reconstruction, an educated guess at what the Celtic myth of the summer solstice might once have been. I am certainly not claiming to have unearthed a lost manuscript or rediscovered a forgotten tradition. But after 4 episodes, tracing the customs, the landscapes, the texts and comparable myths, I think I have enough material to try and tell a story. One that at least fits with what remains, and perhaps can honour what's been lost. We've followed the name of Áine through medieval manuscripts and folktale, and you can download a detailed interpretation of one of her stories in the description. In the last video, we looked at her potential sisters, Sole from the Baltic and Surya from India, to see how the older mythic pattern might help us fill in the gaps. Now, in this final part of the series, I'm going to try and bring those threads together to tell the story that could have been, the myth of a midsummer goddess who appears at the peak of light, who is courted and who resists, thereby setting the rhythm of the year. Again, this isn't a historical certainty but a creative reconstruction. I hope you'll allow that it's at least rooted in what survives. And perhaps, more importantly, it's a partial answer to that first question. What is the Celtic myth of summer solstice? At the height of summer, when the day was longest, the people gathered at the hill that overlooked the lake. They built a great fire on the summit of the hill. Around the fire they placed torches, and from those torches they marked a path across the land. The torchlit path led from the hill to a large standing stone on the plain below. This was the road for the goddess. When the fire was kindled and the sun still shone in the western sky, the people looked down at the lake and saw the fires and the sun reflected in the waters. When they saw that, they knew the time was right. And then she came. She rose from beneath the hill, coming out of the ground itself, leading white cattle and women. In her hand was a drum. She beat it as she walked, setting the pace and the rhythm. No one walked before her. The women wore yellow flowers and carried herbs gathered at dawn. These were herbs for protection and had been picked before the sun had dried the dew on them. The goddess walked the path that had been lit for her. But before she reached the stone at the end of her road, a man stepped forward. He was a king, or he believed himself to be, and he had come to take her hand, not by asking, but by assumed right. He blocked her way and demanded union. He said the land would prosper if she took him as her consort. He said his rule would be sealed by her favour, and their sons would be kings for ages to come. But he didn't kneel. The goddess stopped. She struck him once, and some say she took his ear. Others say she spoke a word that left a mark. And whichever it was, from that day forward, he was no longer fit to rule. She walked around him and went to the stone at the end of her road. It stood at the lake's edge, and as the sun set, it cast a long, narrow shadow. At the final moment of the sun setting, the last full light of midsummer, she stepped into that shadow where the sun had never reached and vanished. That night the fires continued to burn long after the sun had disappeared. The torchlight was carried back and circles were walked sunwise about the hill. Then the torches were brought down into the fields and the fire's ashes were scattered where the crops grew. The golden herbs were hung in houses and stables, and some were burnt, gifted to those long past. And in every year that followed, the people did the same. They kindled the great fire on the hill, they marked the path to the stone, they watched for the light in the lake, They honoured the place of darkness where light never falls. They remembered the man who tried to make a claim and the goddess who didn't stay. What I've just done here, reconstructing a myth from different fragments taken from different cultures and different periods in history, carries a risk. It's not just that this is simply the best guesses of a middle-aged Welshman living in a time and place very different to where these sources first emerged. It's more than that. Because it's really easy to forget that the materials I'm working with aren't timeless myths and archetypes. These stories and songs and poems came from real people, and those people lived in very specific conditions. So if we treat a myth, reconstructed or otherwise, as if it somehow existed outside of those conditions, we turn it into something really abstract and unconnected to the actual living people who contributed to it. We turn it into something it never was. Myths and symbols and rituals and customs are always part of somebody's life. How could it be otherwise? So whatever we're led to believe, myth and culture aren't just timeless. They're not made up of ethereal symbols floating freely above human experience. They're part of and expressed within the messy, complicated and very material realm of the lived world. If we want to really understand, never mind reconstruct the solstice myth, we can't just stop at an abstracted and detached reimagining of it. We're obliged to ask, who lit the fires, who sang the songs, who gathered the herbs, who danced in the circle, and who stood before the goddess? Most of the midsummer customs we've been looking at were performed by ordinary people, rural communities, tenant farmers, women and girls whose work and labour often went totally unacknowledged and unremembered. When herbs were gathered at dawn, it was these nameless people who did the gathering. And when the fires were lit on the hill, it was these people who carried the loads of wood, brought the kindling, shared the food and the drink. And at times, it's almost certainly the case that this work was done by people under pressure. From the nobility, from landlords, from clergy, from the creeping reach of power, from the hardships of poverty. The rites we've described were not only sacred because they were reaching for a goddess, they were also sacred because they were an expression of agency, of self-determination by communities who otherwise had very little freedom. In other words, these rites and myths belonged to the people who enacted them and told them, and they were sacred because they were an expression of these people's freedom. There's another question we need to ask. Why is it that so many of these seasonal myths, not just in Ireland, but across Europe and beyond, revolve around a marriage? Why is the female figure so often beautifully radiant and courted, but then also somehow withdrawing? The midsummer goddess appears to be most powerful at the moment she's about to be claimed. Her radiance is framed as a gift, a blessing, but only briefly. After solstice, she begins to fade. So that moment of marriage marks a turning point, not just for the land, but also for the woman. In traditional societies, marriage may have been a day of celebration, for sure. But it was also very often the beginning of limitation. A girl who once gathered herbs or danced on the hill might later find herself bound to domestic work, cut off from those very same freedoms. That tension shows up in the stories, and so I made it part of my reconstructed myth. Áine doesn't marry the king, she marks him. She refuses and steps back into the shadow. And maybe that's where her real power lies. Not in being chosen, but in choosing. Not in becoming a queen, but in shaping the rhythm of the year by retreating on her own terms. And even when she retreats, the fires still burn, the path is still walked and the herbs are still gathered. She still sets the shape of the rite, and the people follow even when she's not there. So this isn't just a myth about light. It's a myth about sovereignty and the choice to refuse. It's about honouring something that simply cannot be possessed. And in that, it offers more than just a simple nostalgia for a lost age. It's a kind of resistance. It feels like an unspoken, lived desire made sacred in myth and solstice rite. At least that's how I read it as a man living in our modern age. Of course, the customs and stories weren't just about women. They're not only speaking to them, they also hold something for men. Because, at least as I see it, at the turning point of the myth, there is a male figure, a suitor, a challenger, who steps forward and is refused. In the Irish stories, he's a tyrant. So in my own reworking, he also overreaches. He assumes the goddess is his to claim. And when she denies him, he's marked. Not killed, not banished, but changed. His status shifts. And that shift, that moment of realisation, that may be another turning point of the tale. For the suitor, this isn't the triumph of brute strength. It's not the reward of dominance. It's a lesson in limits. In many ways, it's a story about how men are shaped not by what they can take, but by what they're refused. The challenge isn't to win the goddess, it's to recognise that she is not a prize, that presence and power simply aren't ours to claim. A similar lesson can be read in other stories from the Celtic world, as in that of Pwyll and Rhiannon or Lleu and Blodeuedd. For men, almost always dominant in the last few ages of our history, this may be less about victory and more about restraint, about learning the difference between privilege and right, between honour and power. The suitor stands at the threshold, not to possess the land, but to be judged by it, and if necessary, to step back. And that's not a punishment, it's a form of initiation. So that's what I've written into the story. That's what I'm taking for granted. The men in the story aren't banished from the ritual. They're very much still a part of it. They gather and cut the wood. They carry the loads up the hill. They light the torches. They sing the songs. They take on the role of the one who's refused. And by doing so, they uphold the right. They help keep the balance. And in that, they find a different kind of role. Not as conquerors, but as witnesses. I'd like to think there's a kind of grace in that. A way of participating in the sacred without needing to control it. And maybe, for men shaped by cultures that so often equate masculinity with possession and easy dominance, this story offers something more mature and more demanding. It's a reminder of where light ends and shadow begins. And in standing there, not with entitlement, but with simple respect, our dignity preserved. So we began with a question. What was the Celtic myth of the summer solstice? We looked in the texts and found nothing, but we kept looking. In the customs, in the folklore, in the land itself, and eventually in the patterns of stories told far beyond Ireland. From that search, I've pieced together something that may not be old, but at least echoes the older traditions. A myth that begins in radiance, pivots on refusal, and ends in retreat. A story not of conquest or consummation, but of thresholds and turnings. But more than that, we asked what it meant, not just as a poetic image, but as a lived experience. Who carried the wood? Who gathered the herbs? Who danced? And what we found was that the myth, if it ever really existed, really belongs to those whose lives were shaped by the limits of gender, by class, and by power. That's what I found in my search, not a complete myth, but a rhythm of life expressed in dance and fire, in silence and shadow. And that rhythm still has something to say, because maybe what we're looking for isn't a myth that tells us what used to be. Maybe what we need is a myth that helps us feel what still matters now.